We're going to talk today about Advent a bit, and we're going to talk about some of the symbols that we have in Advent and some of the nature wisdom that comes into those symbols. And so we're going to start at the beginning. It's kind of like Maria sang in The Sound of Music. Let's start at the very beginning. So we will. So we're going to start at the beginning of the Bible. The first verse, first chapter, and the first couple verses of the second chapter is the story of the creation. This story of the creation is the one that is not about Adam and Eve. The Adam and Eve story of creation is much older than this particular story. This story was written much later in history, and it was written by the priestly clan of people. And it was written from a priest's point of view. And so priests were interested in making sure that people did their sacrifices. Priests were interested that people came to Jerusalem at the right festival days and all of that kind of stuff. So this is kind of woven into this priestly account. So I'm going to skip to verse 14. You know the story in the beginning, etc., etc. Verse 14 says, "And God said, 'Let there be light in the dome of the sky that separates the day from the night. Let them be for the signs and the seasons and for days and years.'" And then as you read along, the plants come and then the animals come and then finally human beings come and all of those kinds of things happen. And at the end of each day, God saw and it was good. Now creation, of course, as we understand in Genesis, and as we understand, was not a scientific account of creation. It was a spiritual accounting of creation. But it's becoming more scientific now as we begin to look at creation as consciousness and vibration, and light is energy, and energy is matter, and all that stuff. It kind of is more closely related to what we know about science today than it was when it was written, of course. So when you reflect on the story of creation, there is a section that says something like this. I'm going to ask you a question. Do you know why the sun and the moon and the stars were created?
For our pleasure.
To provide light in the darkness.
Okay, so there's light. Okay, there's obviously the sun is light and so forth. But it says in the story of creation from the priestly account, talks about one of the purposes of the sun, the moon, and the stars was to mark the seasons, the days, and the years, and therefore the religious festivals. So people as far back as we know in history, doesn't matter what their spirituality is or what their religion was in those ancient days, all of them seem to be very interested and dependent upon the position of the sun and the moon and the stars for their celebrations, their spiritual, religious celebrations, their cultural celebrations, or whatever it was going to be. They all were very dependent upon that. Just think of Stonehenge, or think of New Grange in Ireland, and think of our own Native American Southwest, where the famous sun dagger is in the Chaco National Park area. All designed to mark solstices and other equinoxes, etc. So people have been marking history in various different ways. Today, some people mark history by whether it's baseball season, football season, or hockey season, or soccer season, or whatever it is. The church, as you know, marks history or marks our calendar in a different sort of way. Today is New Year's Day in the church's liturgical calendar, Advent 1. We have a series of three-year series of readings. We moved from Series C to Series A now. So we're starting Series A in our readings. So we need to think about the church and how we mark history, and not history, but calendars and all of those kinds of things. And we need to remember that the church was founded and basically grew up in the northern hemisphere of the globe before it went out into the world. It was a time that people were in that part of the world. The church had a very famous phenomena that took place in the world that helped us understand how many different cultures of people were involved in this Christian movement. You remember from Acts, it says that there were not only Jews, but they were also Gentiles and Romans and Greeks and Parthians and Medes and Elamites and the residents of Mesopotamia and Judea and Cappadocia and Pontus and Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene. You remember that from Pentecost Day, of course. Acts. Well, there's other people that are also living in there also, probably, and there were other people that were early adopters of Christianity, such as the Celts and even the Vikings, and a host of other people and cultures. So now we need to think about what happened to Christianity once it got started. All right, so Christianity, when it first started, was basically a Jewish movement, and then became more of a Christian movement when the Jews and those who were following Christ started fighting with each other. But it started out as a Jewish Christian movement. So think of it like this. Have you ever built a snowman or a snow woman or a snow animal? I remember one Easter vacation we built a snow Easter bunny in Ohio. But if you ever built any kind of snow creature, you know how it works. You start off with a little tiny ball of snow. Think of that little tiny ball of snow as the basics of Christianity, the Judeo-Christian understanding of the world at that point in time. And you start rolling that little ball down a hill or around the yard, and as you roll it in wet snow, layer after layer after layer builds up on it. And that kind of represents the way Christianity grew in the world as it spread out into the world. And each layer that is added is kind of represents the different cultures and each culture's unique customs and seasonal celebrations and philosophies and nature wisdom that gets added to their understanding of this Christ event as history goes on. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about some of those customs and nature wisdoms that got incorporated into Christianity. So let's start at the very beginning again. When was Jesus born?
Springtime of
we don't really know. Most people will say 4 BC is a kind of a thing, but nobody was really paying attention to a working class baby being born in a small country. A boy being born out of wedlock. Nobody was paying any attention to that kind of stuff. But we do know that Jesus' life, his teaching, his preaching, and finally his passion, death, resurrection, and ascension really affected the core of many people. And that effect not only affected those few people, but it affected many, many more people throughout history. It affected cultures and civilizations for 2,000 years now. Obviously, it affected you, or you wouldn't be here today. Mm-hmm. Well, people's hearts and minds were transformed and changed through Christ. Now, those of you who remember Jesus Christ Superstar may remember the opening song that Judas sings. Every time I look at you, I don't understand. You'd have managed better if you had it planned. Why'd you choose such a backward time in such a strange land? If you'd come today, you could have reached the whole nation. Israel in 4 BC had no mass communication. So, we don't know the time, we don't know the date, we don't know much about it, but we do know that Jesus affected people in a very important way. And so after his resurrection, there were some people that wanted to write down what they were observing and how people were being changed, and they wanted to spread that good news to other people. And so they started writing a written record. And in doing so, they created a whole new form of literature at that time, which we call the Gospels today. Gospel, of course, is Old English for good news. And so they wrote these down. Now, Mark was the first one, even though it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark's the first one who wrote. And he wrote about 40 years, we think, after the resurrection. And he doesn't give us any account of the birth of Jesus. Instead, he gives us this long thing. So-and-so begot so-and-so, so-and-so begot so-and-so, so-and-so. And in the begots, there's a whole lot of theology there that we could talk about at another time. But he doesn't talk anything about the birth of Jesus. He just gives all his genealogy. Now, Matthew and Luke, who wrote a little bit later than Mark, both have birth stories in them. But if you lay them side by side, they're not, they don't match. The stories don't match. And so what we know today as the Christmas story is kind of a weaving together or a melding together of those two accounts. So then we come to John. Now John was really kind of late on the scene. He wrote about 90 years after the resurrection. And so, and he's much more philosophical. He's not worried about this birth in a manger or stable or whatever. He's into philosophy and theology and spirituality. And he starts out his gospel, in the very beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him. Without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came to his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons and daughters of God, even to them that believeth on his name. So, again, very philosophical, but he focuses on the change that Jesus brings into the world. So that brings us back to, so when was Jesus born? Well, as Stephen was saying, Luke gives us one idea about when Jesus was born. Because as we sing in Christmas carols, shepherds abiding in their fields by night. Okay, if you raise sheep in the time of Jesus and you were a shepherd, for the most part, I mean, we have this picture of David out in the fields with his sheep and all that kind of stuff. But most shepherds brought their sheep back to the city every day, to a little corral next to their house. And so the only time that they were ever out in the fields by night was during lambing season, because they couldn't be stressing the mother's sheep, bringing them back and forth. So they spent the night out in the fields during lambing season, also to protect the young lambs that were being born. And lambing season is the time of Jesus would have been in March. So if we go by Luke, Jesus was born in March. So who knows? And does it really matter at a certain point? So if Jesus, we don't know when Jesus was born, why do we end up celebrating Jesus' birthday on December 25th? Well, first of all, you need to understand, at least for 300 years, Christians didn't give a hoot about Christmas. They didn't celebrate it. It wasn't part of what they did. What they did celebrate, though, was the Epiphany, the coming of the wise men. And so, for 300 years, Christmas was no big deal. And then it started to build, and about, we think about 336, they started celebrating Christmas in December. Now, why did they do that? Well, there's two theories. One theory is that, I think it's more of a Roman myth or an urban myth. But one theory is that there was a Roman emperor, who said, well, we'll calculate 9 months after the Annunciation, I don't know how in the world he figured out what the date of the Annunciation was. I have no idea. But the Annunciation is celebrated on March 25th, and so 9 months later is December 25th. So that's one way it might have been. Probably the other way is maybe a little more realistic. And that was December 25th in the Roman Empire. That period of time, 25th, 24th, 26th, whatever, is around the equinox, first of all.
Solstice.
Solstice, not equinox, solstice. The winter solstice, to be exact. Around the solstice. And it was the time that they had a festival to the god Saturn. And they had these big festivals called Saturnalia. And it was an agricultural festival, and it was, big deal. People were out reveling in the streets, etc. It was also a time where the Persian god Mithra, who was a god of light, was also celebrated around this winter solstice time. So the theory is that Christians who wanted to celebrate Christmas figured out this was a good time, because this was a time during Christian persecution. And so you didn't want to be obvious in celebrating Christmas. So you were celebrating, people didn't know what you were celebrating, because everybody was celebrating something, so they could get away with it. And so they kind of settled on December 25th, and they kind of rationalized it by saying, well, it says winter solstice, and Jesus represents the coming of light into the world. And so that's how we ended up on December 25th, basically. Now that's not taking into account all the calendar changes that took place in history, but that's basically where we are. So the celebration of Christmas then, as Christianity spread into Northern Europe, it followed with them. Christmas followed, the celebrations of that, and then when the people came to the United States, or what we know as the United States, North America, and the Spaniards and the English, they brought Christmas with them, so to speak. But even though that was part of their tradition, for some Christians, the Puritans had nothing to do with Christmas. It was against the law to celebrate Christmas. They said the reason we don't want to celebrate Christmas is it's too pagan. And the reason it was considered pagan is what we're going to talk about today. Because remember that snowball effect? Because as always different traditions got added to them, what we would call pagan traditions or non-Christian traditions got added into Christianity. First of all, you know what the word pagan means?
No.
It means something like hillbilly or country folk or country bumpkin. It was a derogatory term for somebody who lived in the country. That's what the word pagan means. So we have these things happening. Now, it wasn't until 1870 that Christmas became a federal holiday. Because, they didn't want anything to do with these pagans. Some early Americans said, Christmas came with the British. We don't want anything to do with the British after the Revolution, especially not those redcoats. So, no Christmas, basically, for a long time. So, we have Advent, of course, and I'll be sending something out more about Advent, and we kind of talked about Advent before. Means the coming of Jesus, waiting for the coming of Jesus, not only for his birth, but for his coming into our hearts, and possibly for the second coming. Well, we're back to northern Germany now, and we're back to where the Vikings and the northern Germans lived. And they had traditions that they celebrated in the winter. And one of the traditions that the Vikings had was that when winter came, they had these very valuable wagon wheels. Wagon wheels were hard to make, and you didn't want them laying out in the snow during the winter. So you didn't have barns really, so you brought them into your house. And you can just imagine Mrs. Viking saying, "What are we going to do with these wagon wheels?" So somebody came up with the idea, well, we can hang at least one up here in the ceiling. And so they hang a wagon wheel up in the ceiling, and then they thought, well, that's a good place to put some candles. It shed lights all over the whole house. So candles appeared on the wagon wheel, and they maybe put some greens along the wagon wheel too to represent the life of the winter out there. And for their particular religion, the wagon wheel represented their hope that God would turn the wheel of the sky and the earth back to summer. And so that's how they did it. So when Christianity came, they incorporated this hanging wagon wheel into what we know today as an Advent wreath. And the greens, of course, representing the everlasting life made possible in Jesus Christ. The candles on the Advent wreath remind us, of course, that Jesus is the light of the world. And they're a countdown device, too. As we get closer to Christmas, there's more and more light, reminding us that the light of Christ should be growing in us and increasing in us daily and in our hearts daily, especially during this Advent season. And it also reminds us that in order for a candle to shine, in the old days before we had liquid candles, what happened to the candle when it was lit and it burned?
Burned down.
It burnt down. It got smaller, didn't it? Because the candle had to give of itself to give light. A reminder to us as Christians, we have to give of ourselves to let Christ's light shine through us. So that's where Advent wreaths maybe came from. You can see that's pretty pagan, so that's why the Puritans didn't want anything to do with that. Yule logs. What's a Yule log? A Yule log is a huge log. Now remember back in the days when you had cabins like this, or houses, your fireplace was not some decorative little thing here in the living room. The fireplace was huge. I mean, you could walk into the fireplace almost, because that's where you did your cooking, That's where the fire was. It's where you did your cooking. So a Yule log was a tradition when you brought in a log that would pretty much be the length of your hearth. And you would start it on fire, maybe during Advent or maybe during Christmas. And it was, of course, another one of those pre-Christian traditions. They got moved into Christianity. And so the Christians said, okay, people do Yule logs, so let's make it spiritual. So we said, okay, the fire represents the evil in the world, and it's burning up and stuff, and eventually becomes ash. And the log turns to ashes. It symbolizes Christ's final and ultimate victory over sin and death. Okay, there are some plants that we associate with Christmas too. There's one Christmas song that we sing that's nothing except about plants. You know what that one is?
Holly and the ivy.
Yeah, the holly and the ivy. Yeah, okay. Why are we singing about holly and ivy at Christmas time? Well, first of all, ivy's a vine, right? And it grows. And you remember that verse back in the Bible? Sometimes and Jesus says, I am the blank and you are the branches. I am the vine and you are the branches. And so that got incorporated into this thinking about ivy. And ivy spreads, doesn't it? And so it was a symbol of how the church and the good news of Christ was spreading in the world. Holly. What about holly? What do we know about holly? What's the tradition about holly?
Evergreen.
First of all, it's evergreen during the winter, and that was important in the Northlands.
There's a watch found red berries.
It has red berries on it.
Prickly.
It's prickly, but it was believed that holly protected you from evil.
Yeah.
And so you see the significance now? It was Christ who protects us from evil. And the red berries represent where the crown of thorns prickled Christ's head and little drops of red blood came out. And so that's the significance of holly and the ivy. Another plant that we use sometimes during Christmas is the bay or bay laurel, which grows around here actually. And in that particular time of Jesus' life, etc., you know, the victors of athletic events were given a wreath of laurel or bay laurel or whatever. And so it was the crown of the victor, right? And Timothy reminds us, he says, "Thanks be to God, God gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." And so that became associated with Jesus and the victory that he gives us over sin and death. Over there's a tree on the window. Next week we're going to talk about the Jesse tree. So we'll save that little bit of information until next week. But it's also the time of the year when we're starting to think about Christmas trees. So we need to talk about a Christmas tree a little bit. Okay, again, Northern European thing, you know, everything's snowy out there and all the leaves come off most of the trees, and you have these evergreen trees, symbol of life and hope and all of those kinds of things. And it was, you know, the tradition to bring the Tannenbaum into the house before Christianity. Well, of course, we baptized these Tannenbaums and call them Christmas trees. So, so what do you put on the top of your Christmas tree?
Angel. Star.
A star or a
Angel.
angel, yeah. And what does that star or angel represent?
Light. No.
The messenger of God, right? Telling.
The king.
More broader. Stars and angels represent heaven.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Okay, so they represent heaven. So at the top of the tree you have this representation of heaven. What do you put under the tree?
Presents.
Before that, you
Tree
put
skirt.
a tree skirt.
No.
And in the old days, what were tree skirts made out of? Usually, I know in my house when I grew up,
Cloth.
Wool.
a white sheet.
Oh, white sheet.
That was very common, at least in Ohio. Everybody had white sheets under their trees.
Oh, okay.
And so the white sheet under the tree, of course, represents snow
Yeah.
or the ground. And so you have this archetypal symbol of the tree
Sort of the world tree.
connecting, in all cultures, the tree connects heaven and earth, right? And so that Christmas tree represents that, what Christ accomplished for us, representing connecting heaven to earth. And so that's the significance of these trees we bring into our houses, or these plastic trees we unwrap every year. Now, what do we put on the Christmas tree? Ornaments. What kind of ornaments we put on the Christmas tree?
All kinds.
What are some examples of the kinds of ornaments we put on the Christmas tree?
Things my kids made when they were little. Yeah.
Okay, things from about your family. We have
Angels, bells.
yeah, lights, of course, the light of Christ and all of that. And sparkly little ornaments, and maybe even religious ornaments. Maybe animals. I have a lot of animal ornaments. We also collected ornaments when we went on vacations. So we have an ornament for Alaska and northern Wisconsin and so forth and so on. I think a lot of people did that. And so we have this tree representing heaven and earth, and all of the parts of our lives are represented on there, isn't it? Children's ornaments, collections of other ornaments. I have ornaments that were my parents. I have ornaments that were given to me when I was first a priest in northern Wisconsin. I had no ornaments, and people in the parish gave me ornaments. I have their ornaments yet. And some of those ornaments were pretty old when they gave them to me. And so it just represents everything. And then when we got married, and Mark brings his ornaments, and I bring my ornaments, and then, so it represents all of those kinds of things, our family and our history, and our fun and our joy in life. So we're going to stop there. We'll talk about some of the other symbols as we go on through the season. But I want to remind you, if you were here 2 weeks ago, what we did 2 weeks ago, we talked about the spiritual life and preparing for Advent. And I hope by this time you have kind of decided what you want to do during this Advent season in order to help prepare your heart and your mind for this renewal of energy that comes with us at Christmas time. What are you going to do? And to help you in that process, I have brought little notebooks for you, which I will give you as you go out. And you can keep a little track of things in there. It can be a gratitude notebook, or it can be other kinds of thoughts. But thoughts that, come to you this time of year as you prepare for Christmas and the coming of Jesus into our hearts again. So, that's the end of the sermon for today. Thank you.
Wonderful.